Well, here we are post-election, and joining us today on The Informed, we've got Caroline Counsell again, one of Australia's leading family law experts. We've got John Heron, victims advocate, solicitor, and ran for federal parliament in the seat of McEwen for the Liberal Democrats. We've got Ian Cook, director of I Cook Foods and infamy of the Sludgate saga. And we've also got Mario Beeks, the author of Blood and Soil, a security consultant and a former military Croatian officer. Welcome, team.
Morning.
Morning.
Now, if ever the truism of oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them, has there been any greater example of that than this election?
No.
Okay, we can move on now. Thanks, that was a great show.
Rephrase the question.
With less than 70% of the primary vote going to the two majors, will this be a trend? Is it a blip, an aberration? What's going on here?
Well, just talk about the raw number. You're quite right. So the ALP getting 31% of the national primary vote is not exactly a mandate. So people argue about preference voting, but just look at the Senate. So in the Senate, the only two states where the Labor Party had a majority over the Liberal Party was WA and the ACT. So again, if you look at Queensland, I looked at some numbers yesterday. The Liberal Party won 33% of the Senate vote and the Labor Party 24%. Labor Party is only going to have 25 seats out of, I think, 76 in the Senate. So they're going to need to deal with other parties continuously. So I think what that really tells you in the raw numbers is that Australians voted across the board and didn't really give a mandate for the ALP. I think the raw numbers just say that.
That's interesting.
Sorry, Ingo.
Well, it says, I've heard the arguments both ways for preferential voting versus what the English or the American with the first past the post. And given that most of the preference voting comes from a how to vote card, there's not a lot of people actually sit down and think about separating out who they're going to have as their preference, which is why the deals then obviously become quite important. And I guess this is showing us what happens with preferential voting. You don't necessarily, in one way, it makes sure that you get a government or someone, otherwise it would be quite fragmented. But by the same token, I'm not sure that it's as representative of what the people really wanted when they went into the ballot box. I think there's probably a high level of, people voting as a protest rather than realising what's going to happen to their government by their actions, which you talked about before in terms of people voting for independence and how that can affect the way government is run.
We saw a lot go to the teal or unseat what would be termed as moderate Liberals in these teal seats. But now that Labor has been able to, or looks like Labor are about to form a majority government, have their votes been wasted because they'll actually get no say? The electorate might do all right now because they need to win them back. But did Simon Holmes à Court spend his money wisely?
A very interesting question.
Well, I think if you eliminate the word wise, you'll just see that he spent some money. That's probably your answer there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
well, in some, it would appear what he wanted was to make sure that people like Frydenberg were unseated, and from that point of view, it worked. And you know what? Now that we have these independents in, and on election night, I was listening to a couple of them, Zali Steggall and the woman that took Frydenberg's seat, and both of them said that they'd spoken to the electorate, and the electorate told them the two major things were climate change and integrity, and having this integrity commission federally. And you know what? Okay, we are where we are. Good on them. Congratulations for winning. Now I want to see this integrity commission moved fairly quickly. Albanese said he was going to do it. They should hold him to task and make him do it. That's not going to cost him a fortune, not the $3 billion you're talking about, Mario, before. Get it up, get it running. because we've got a couple of things they can investigate very quickly. The misuse of federal funds, not just the capital funds, but also the ongoing subsidies that they paid to people like Community Chef. That's corruption 101. That should be first on the list of his corruption commission. And I'm hoping that these independents do what they say they said they're going to do, and make sure that he does it.
Do you have the faith, John, in independence? You know, I mean, like, sorry interrupting you, but I don't have the faith in the independence. We spoke about this very, very heavily, John, and you and I, and Carol and Michael, before the elections, what the independence is going to be. And I agree with you. People voted more as a protest to the previous government rather than for the policies. And as I said before, I'm on a trip right now. When I saw the results, I couldn't believe, and secondly, that independent commission, what you said, you know, is going to be formed. I think we're going to wait for this for a very long time, John.
I disagree. I have to disagree. I believe Labor, if Mark Dreyfus is Attorney General, I can tell you now, the legislation is virtually written for it. It will be something that goes ahead. And quite frankly, the major legal bodies around the country are going to hold Labor to account in relation to that. So even if the Teals don't exert pressure on government, the lawyers in the country will exert pressure on the government. And luckily, we've worked quite closely with Mark Dreyfus in the past. So I suspect it will go ahead. I think that's, in other words, it's one of the most tangibly easy gets for the new government to achieve. It's templated around the country in any event in the various states. The question will be whether the ICAC has teeth. And that's where the focus should be. The devil will be in the detail, but we, the lawyers of Australia, want to ensure that it has real power, it has real investigative power, and there are consequences as a result of uncovering corruption.
So to pass the legislation, the Labor Party will need all of the Greens in the Senate. And now there's two Jackie Lambie Brains Trust in the Senate now. So they're going to have to get them as a minimum to get it through. Probably not a difficult task. So you would imagine that would get through. Just some memory at some of the forums that I attended and hearing people's questions. I would say that the ICAC, whatever they want to deem it, was not an unimportant subject. So the Liberal Party really didn't have a response to say, why didn't you do it sooner? So that was a big own goal. The climate change, of course, was everywhere. Back in the seat of McEwen, where I was, as you would expect, the Greens got about 15% of the vote. But their biggest vote in my electorate, of course, was Mount Macedon. So you probably never ever seen a sedan car or anyone ever caught public transport there. So that's indicative of people they're not worried about price of petrol or anything called cost of living, because they can easily afford it. But they were concerned about climate. But again, if I go down to the seat with the Labor Party in my seat, had a 5% swing against them as well. So people were devoid of choice. That was a really important thing. It wasn't they didn't give a mandate for Albo and his gang to get in. That's for sure. The raw vote says that. But also there was no mandate or want of choice for the other side of things. So people were absolutely devoid of choice, and they just fill out their ballot papers. I could see as I walked into the polling stations, half of them couldn't care at all. So that's the point we're at the moment with democracy.
So, Michael, it's really interesting that we talk about the teal phenomenon and whether this is a blip or whether this is the emergence of something new. But we've seen wedge politics before, and it often fizzles. It doesn't take shape. It doesn't form a new party with any real meaning or vigor or power. I'm concerned that this is just a lashback rather than a step in a new direction and a new form of political party emerging.
Well, it's definitely set the agenda going forward that the climate is important. And once we see the majors latch onto this, I think they'll recruit those that left will come back. The other thing, the integrity is obviously something that's important. And I think that's displayed in the extremely low, as we said, under 70% for the two majors in first preference votes. I think that comes back directly to the integrity, where people have just had enough of the self-serving politicians. So going forward now, we've just seen China give Albo his first real test. Would that have happened, do you think, if the government hadn't have changed, with them now going into, I think it's 10 island nations throughout the South Pacific?
No, they wouldn't have done it with the previous government. Now, the path is easier. Path of least resistance is in power now. So again, having lived and worked throughout the Pacific, Chinese money talks. It's as simple as that. And that's, again, we've talked before about the Solomon Islands. So that's back on the agenda. Albo, prior to the election, said it was because of climate change in the Solomons, which baffles them. And now that mantra came out again yesterday. So it wasn't a case of bad diplomacy. So you mentioned previously that China's out in Fiji. It's quite a simple thing. It's just a cash diplomacy. And China now, emerging from COVID, has got the cash that the other countries don't have. So if you go to any developing world, that cash just basically buys you the country. It's just that simple.
I concur, John, and I mentioned this, before this one. I saw in Singapore and I saw in the Philippines, the sphere of Chinese influence is tremendously growing rapidly. And when I talk to the locals and people why this is happening and everything else, they all come back to this thing, they're being betrayed and the blame game. So our Prime Minister, he has a difficult task to understand what's going on in the field, because I truly believe while the entire world was sleeping during the COVID, Chinese were doing the bit across the Asia and Pacifics. And it's very difficult to not understand why people are gonna line up with China, because China represents for them, strong partner in prosperity, in abundance, and creating the better life and better things. While Australia is going to have a very difficult road to prove themselves back in those nations.
Yeah, it was painted as a big fault of Morrison's. He was asleep at the wheel. All of the other pejorative terms that saw the Solomons, we ignored them. And so it was a massive blunder, is how it was portrayed. And now we see China going into Fiji and all of the other ones. The other one that gets me now is a change in messaging coming into it with Chalmers. Only Labor has a plan. Only Labor can address the $1 trillion debt. Only Labor can do this. And then suddenly, in the last day or two, we've inherited a dire situation. There's no magic wand. No government can wave this. What happened to the plan?
What plan?
It's a bit like Soviet 5-year plans, except there's probably more transparency in the Soviet Union. So I think that was a strategy they worked through, which was to say, the South Labor Party, I've got a plan for this, I've got a plan for that, I've got a plan for that. When in reality, we knew there's no plan for anything, basically. So that was the mantra that just got them through the election. So I don't think nothing's going to come to pass there. We'll wait and see. I'm not going to hold my breath. I just want to quickly mention one thing about China. So just prior to the election, you had Dutton putting the blowtorch really hard on China, Chinese spy ships. Now that rhetoric is absolutely evaporated now. And you've got Penny Wong floating around Asia. So if anything, it may actually be a good thing that pressure on China is absolutely gone. No coincidence that the Xi Jinping's deputy rang up Albo to congratulate him. Now, that wouldn't happen with the Liberal Party, so I'll end it on that one.
Well, if I can add something, John, or something else, while we are discussing this right now, China has one of the biggest military exercise together with Russia. And I read it while I was in Europe. They're gonna go this summer. They're gonna go Russian and Chinese Navy gonna exercise in China Sea. Now, if you take into consideration what's happening in Ukraine and all these embargoes and sanctions in Russia, I have no doubt that China's gonna go together hand by hand with Russia. Into these allied nations as well. See, this is how I see it's gonna develop, that relation between the China and Russia, as well as gonna sort of spill into the zone of Chinese influence across the Pacific and Asia as well.
Yeah. All right. And now the Liberal Party, where to from here for them? We see Dutton unopposed as new leader. Is he the man to take them to the job, or is this a poison chalice for whoever's in opposition now, the leader of the opposition? Will they be there at the next election?
I think Dutton will. I think he's fairly strong. Now, I'm sure that there'll be a whole lot of left-leaning people who will probably hate him with the same vengeance that they did Tony Abbott. But I think he's quite a strong person. I think he also can speak to the average man, if you put it that way. So it'll be very interesting. But yeah, I could see him going all the way through. Whether he would be successful, I don't know, because it would be perceived as a swing to the right, is the way I see it. Whether that's a good or a bad thing for the Liberal Party, I don't know. But what we need is someone, whether it's Dutton or even someone from the Labor Party, and preferably the moderate side of the Labor Party, stand up and be a statesman and give us a vision and show us where we're going forward, and not, as you said, Michael, before, say, we have a plan, we have a plan, we have a plan. All Albanese was doing was making himself, he wanted to be a small target. He knew nothing. He had all those gaffes, because he really didn't have a plan. And what we want is someone stronger, someone who stands up and says, here's what Australia can do, here's how we can do it. And I think people will rally behind that from whichever side.
Yeah, coming into the election, did Labor drag the Libs to the left, or did the Libs drag Labor to the right, do you think?
Yeah, interesting question. I think to a certain degree, they were trying very hard, particularly from that a climate change point of view, of dragging them back from the other side. And I find the climate change argument quite interesting. Putting aside whatever my own beliefs are, I look at what happened in Queensland in the previous election. They were decimated because the Greens were all against Adani. Adani was going to spend all this money and put all these jobs into Queensland, and Queenslanders rebelled against that and said, you know what, park climate change, we're not going to sell black coal. We want that investment, and we want those jobs, and we want that funds. I mean, Queensland and WA survive on iron ore and coal. Without that, Australia would be broke. And that's not saying that climate change is not real and that there aren't problems that need to be addressed. It's just a reality that that's the way Australia's economy works.
Yeah. It's funny, the other day I was out in front of Frydenberg's office. I was out for a walk, and there was a big diesel four-wheel drive BMW with the Save Climate stickers all over it, and they were down the street with their thing. And I happened to say to them, the diesel four-wheel drive you got down there? Oh, what? It's yours. No, it's not. It's got your bollards and everything in it. Oh, so the reality of activism, climate activism, is a lot different to the actual outcomes. Now, Clive Palmer, what happened there? I didn't get a text message from Craig Kelly telling me that he'd conceded he wasn't going to be the new Prime Minister. Massive spend that he'd gone, and it went nowhere. What do you think that was?
What you probably don't realise is that he'll actually get his money back. So if you get more than, and I'm aware of this myself, if you get more than 4% of the vote, you basically get around $1.20 a vote or something. So he got that level in almost all of the seats he stood in, and the Senate too. So basically he spent $20 million. He'd probably get about 17 back from that. Just let that sink in. So it wasn't, that's probably not raised enough. I saw in my seat where the candidate didn't even live there, and he didn't really turn up. But he had lots of bodies on the ground, some paid for. He easily got his 5%. So across the nation, it was about 5%, 4 to 5%. So, like, he made his point. It didn't cost him anything, and fade off into oblivion. Come back again, probably. Actually,
I think, I think the UAP would probably do better if they sideline Clive. And that's, you know, I don't have a view on Clive Palmer one way or the other, but he doesn't, I wouldn't have said he has a good media presence in terms of people following and voting for him. And yet some of the candidates that I listened to sounded quite articulate and reasonable sorts of people.
And it was interesting just being out in the community before the election and hearing a level of support which surprised me for the party, for the UAP. So I was a bit taken aback by that, but maybe I shouldn't be, because these are all forms of protest voting. And we said before, it's because of the lack of choice. And we're going to see the ascendancy of other players in the political spectrum. I think it's a very interesting and dynamic time for Australian politics, but it's really, the electorate is saying, somebody step up, somebody please acquit yourselves. So that's the challenge for Dutton. Going back to your question, Michael, if Dutton can reinvent himself, and it'd have to be a pretty big makeover to appeal to the Australian public, anything can happen. This is anyone's game, in my opinion.
Yeah. Now,
yeah, I was surprised too, Caroline, with clients that came to me and said they'd vote UAP.
Yep.
So it's about 1 in 20, but you want to cap that. Even in my seat, Pauline Hanson got 5% of the vote as well. So if you added up all the, they call them freedom groupings, they average 15% in each electorate. And if you translate that out into the Senate, none of them got any seats. Maybe, I think Pauline Hanson might have got her seat back. But again, in our system, all those people have no representation in Parliament, whatever their broad agendas may be. And actually, if you want to say that, the way that the Senate quota system works, the big green vote means that they're actually quite underrepresented in the Senate, because they get a quota of what's called one. They get over one, but they'll only get a senator in each state. So anyway, but that's my.
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, look, I did want to say about the voting system in Australia. Like, it has to be some sort of reform. Every other country in the world has voting reform. We don't, except for Canada. So Canada's got Trudeau gets elected on 32% of the vote time and again, and makes all the shots in Canada, but it's first past the post, as Ian referred to, like one vote, that's it. I really think we need to have some proportional representation, such as New Zealand and Germany, or some variation of that. So all of these people so you have proper representation, like 15% of those of the population, no say whatsoever at all. So it has to be that your vote counts for something and represents somebody. The current system that we have now, with a 31% primary vote, is no mandate to run the country. So we're in all sorts of trouble, but there doesn't seem to be the appetite. People are happy with the status quo in two parties. So unless that changes, we're doomed.
all right, just to wind up with now, team, we've got the Victorian elections coming up in 6 months, and we saw
that's going to be good.
Yeah. What impact do you think? What can we read from these? We saw a fairly significant drop in Labor, even though Labor cleaned up. I think the average swing against them was around almost 4%. Some seats dropped incredibly. My seat of Hawke, they went from, I think it was about a 14%, even though it's a new seat, they went from about a 14% safe seat, and they lost 9% of it. So our local snake catcher got 15% of the vote. So what do we think is going to happen in Victoria? Was this an omen? Is there anything we can read into it?
Yes. So I believe on the voting in Mulgrave, where Andrews is, he will lose his seat. So that appears to be the numbers there. That groundswell of anti-Andrews. It's hard to determine how, like you mentioned, Hawke and certainly McEwen, where I am. So you should have had a positive swing to the ALP to win power, but you had a 5% swing against Labor there. And that was all on that northern belt of Melbourne, the working class areas. Talk about the Teals, but that amendment has pissed itself out differently.
Caroline, you got any thoughts on that?
Well, clearly I'm a really bad guesser because because I thought the Libs were going to stay in power, but that didn't happen. Once upon a time I used to say, well, if Labor is in power federally, then Victorians like to have a bit of balance and they like to put a Lib in power in Victoria. But I'm not even going to suggest I can predict that. So this is Brave New World. This is interesting, dynamic politics. But I suspect Andrews is out.
Yeah.
I hope you're right, Caroline. Boy, I hope you're right.
Look, people have to, sorry, John, yeah, please continue.
I don't know, I was just going to say, so yes, I hope Caroline's right. Just having a look at it and having a look at the swings against them, there is what you would see, the glimmer of hope. It's that people have seen what's going on. Anecdotally, just talking to people that I know, some people that I might know, not intimately as friends, but people who want to talk about these things anyway, there's a clear understanding of the corruption. And I'm not just talking about our issue, but across the board in Victoria, where you've got a state government that is to ensure that they have control everywhere. Now, that can happen obviously for a period of time, but once it starts to get exposed and starts to break up, that's when you hope the electorate suddenly realise that they have to make a decision. The Libs were decimated. I mean, there's not a lot. They're a fairly small force. The question is whether they are going to get enough support to get out there and tell the right story, or are we going to end up with the same as we just did federally, a whole bunch of independents?
Yeah. And I'm just hoping that people have the not short memory problem, because I believe that then Andrews is going to go into damage control before the elections. And as well, don't forget, he's going to have the support of the PM, and they're going to say how great they are. So I'm truly hoping that it's going to be shifting in the power in Victoria for the sake of everybody.
Yeah. Well, all right, team, we've got to leave it there. So as we race towards the November Victorian elections, I'm sure it'll only get more and more interesting with, it seems, scandals coming out day by day for Andrews to battle against. Thanks again for your time, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Bye all.
See you guys.